There we go. We're recording, and we'll throw up our screen.
And now everything we said before is only known to us.
That's right. I wasn't recording. I don't know about you guys.
Which
Yeah,
might be a
it's
good
also,
thing.
yeah. No evidence of the, I won't say what it was. Okay, so here we go. 9/11, already got our date there, 2001.
Leave them wondering.
You guys who missed it, you missed it. You should have been here.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to talk about the actual attacks on the Twin Towers in our first paragraph. Then we're going to be talking about domestic effects to national security, and then the ensuing war on terror. So we covered this the same topic last year, but with just kind of a slightly different focus. And so obviously this is hopefully was pretty familiar, but with again some slightly new information added to it. Let's see. Attacks. And then actually, I think we'll just stick with the attacks. What details do you think are pertinent to discussing the attacks on September 11th?
I'm trying to think of the large scale effects of like what Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and the other guy, but what they did, and how it shocked the entire nation. It didn't just affect New York; it affected the entire nation of America, even on the other coast.
Okay, and we'll actually get to that, I think, when we get to the second paragraph. That's a good point. But going back to Al Qaeda and militant Islam, yeah, talking about first of all, so who carried it out? What are some details of who carried out the attacks?
Osama bin Laden and the terrorist group Al Qaeda.
Yeah, Al Qaeda. Yeah, so Al Qaeda. I can put that.
And there was some other guy, I forget his name.
Yeah, KSM, Khalik Sheikh Mohammed, I think. I think so. They abbreviate it KSM. Yeah, he was the actual planner. He's like the director and the producer. The motivation behind it was Osama bin Laden. Their terrorist group, Al Qaeda, which means the base, seeking to retaliate for American intervention in the Middle East. Osama bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia, and he was enraged that his country, because Saudi Arabia is actually an ally of the United States, that his country would allow Americans to have troops in Saudi Arabia on sacred Muslim soil, and so he saw that as an offense, and anything the U.S. did intervening in the Middle East, he began to see that as an attack, and wanted, and so this was a chance to strike back. What else? What about the attacks themselves? Details of the attacks themselves?
Well, it was just like a normal news day, and then like they immediately, upon maybe within 3-4 minutes of actually less than that, probably between 1 and 2 minutes of first tower being hit, then they shifted their attention to that report, and then they kept up with that, and then everyone saw that, and then the heroics of the passengers of Flight 93, who brought down the plane over a field in, I think it was Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have 4 hijackings, all of them on the East Coast. They wanted to get planes loaded with fuel that were crossing the country, so they'd be as explosive and flammable as possible. 2 of them are directed at the Twin Towers in New York City, downtown Manhattan. Those buildings are struck 18 minutes apart. The first one, like you said, people had no idea what was going on. Some people thought it was an accident. Nobody had really seen, not many people at least had seen the size of the plane or anything. But then as soon as 18 minutes later, when the second plane hit the other tower, it was clear that there was an attack going on, and that we were dealing with hijacked planes. So then, like you said, a 4th plane was taken over by the passengers, Flight 93. They crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Where do they think that one was heading?
To the Capitol building.
Yeah, they're pretty sure that one was going to try to smash up the Capitol building, Congress. And then what did the third plane do?
Pentagon?
Yeah, that one struck the Pentagon, which is kind of like the military headquarters of the United States.
It only like destroyed a part of it. It like blew out a wall of the Pentagon. It wasn't like a whole. It didn't like destroy the whole entire thing, which was nice.
No, the Pentagon is something like 6 rings of concrete. And so, yeah, the amount of damage that was able to be done to that building, again, it still killed couple hundred people, but nothing like the towers. The towers were so much more vulnerable. And so, yeah, 4 strikes, 4 hijackings. The fourth plane, why were the passengers able to kind of take action with the fourth plane and not have it hit the Capitol building?
It took off late, and so they were able to get calls from like family members who had seen it on the news happen.
Exactly. They were more informed. They had a level of information that the other passengers did not. And so they were able to see that, because they were all being lied to. That, again, the standard procedure for a hijacking is don't upset the hijackers, because you're trying to let them negotiate. You're trying to let the government or whoever, the authorities, listen to their demands and try to let them get you out safely. And so they got on and said, hey, we're going back to the airport. We have a bomb. We're going to submit our demands. And so you would sit passively and try not to, rock the boat, as it were. But by the time the late takeoff for 93, it was clear to them that was baloney, and that if they didn't do anything, more people were going to die. And so, yeah, that's a pretty heroic story. The other heroism, what's the other huge act of heroism that should be mentioned that day? Even though there's countless, but by another large group.
Maybe like the firefighters who went in.
Yes,
right away.
Absolutely. The firefighters who went up into those the burning towers, knowing, there's really nobody knew how to put a fire out that was up 90 flights of 900 feet up in the air, and so those guys were all going up into the building. It was taking them hours. It was going to take them several hours to even get to the impact zone. And so they were all halfway, 3/4 of the way up to the top. Only a couple guys had even made it to the impact zone when the towers ended up collapsing an hour and a half after the first plane strike. So it was an hour and a half after the first one that the 2 towers began to come down, and we lost hundreds of firefighters in the stairwells who were going up, carrying some 100 pounds of gear each, trying to get up to the fire zone. And so that was incredible bravery. Not too many people want to go into a fire, much less a fire in one of the biggest skyscrapers on the planet.
When the firefighters were trying to go up, the fire was melting the scaffolding and the support. It was like warping it because it couldn't handle the temperature. So then the building started lowering.
You got the big steel girders holding up the structure, and they have fireproofing on them, but the explosion of the impact was so intense it blew the fireproofing off. It's just all that jet fuel just creates this incredible inferno, and it melts the supports. And all you needed is if once 1, 2, or 3 floors collapse, then it's like a dominoes. That floor just collapses the next floor, but then them combined collapse the next floor, and then the next floor. And that's why when you watch the buildings go down, it's just this straight down, with the weight of each floor above crushing the floor below it. And right. About how many were killed?
Well, I know it was in the hundreds.
No, it's just under 3,000. Just under 3,000. So making it the deadliest attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a little over 2,000, and then it was around 2,989 or something like that. They're not counting the hijackers. So yeah, like you said, Josh, huge national shock seemed to come out of nowhere. And again, the worst attack we've ever faced again on American soil.
They eventually
it's definitely
found
another
him.
Pearl Harbor. Go ahead.
Didn't they eventually find him in like Afghanistan
Yep, that's what we're going to get to in our third point. Okay. So national security, we want to talk about the domestic effects. And one about how this is a new type of threat that we haven't seen before. and then changes at home, and then finally tensions. So second point, what does national security mean?
The security of the nation.
Yeah, trying to protect the country, exactly. And what type of war is this kind of signal the beginning of, or type of conflict does this signal the beginning of? What do we call it?
War on terrorism, or just
Yeah,
war on-
yeah, terrorism. Again, kind of a word that we all grew up hearing, but was not nearly as commonly spoken in prior periods of U.S. history. So we have this idea of terrorism, which what were the big isms of the 20th century before this? Who else did we fight in the 1900s? What kind of group ideas?
Communism and
Yep.
Soviet Union.
Yeah, communism and fascism. And those are, again, these are nation states. These have armies. They have governments. They have clear boundaries. And so it's clear who you're fighting, who the enemy is. You can point to them. Where now all of a sudden you have this faceless, uniformless. They're not an army. They're not even a country. It's like, who do we attack? And we're going to get into the Afghanistan-Iraq thing. But even then, it's not like that was the nations there. Like how do we even begin to deal with this threat? You also have the fact that the U.S. wanted to be very kind of isolationist, but if we leave these guys alone, now with global travel and the fact that there's just a few of them and they're using things like airlines and they can attack, small scale but devastating attacks. Now all of a sudden we're going to have to go and preemptively stop them abroad. And again, we'll talk about that more in the third point. But just in this first idea, appreciating that this is not something the world had ever faced. It's not something our military was really kind of geared towards combating. We'd been fighting fascism. We were going to fight the communists. We're building SDI, missile shields, and that sort of stuff. And now all of a sudden we've got this with just a few guys with box cutters. We're able to bring down these amazing towers, and kill almost 3,000 people. So it's definitely a big pivot in terms of, okay, how are we going to protect ourselves against this? And that's going to bring a lot of changes. What were there two big changes you could cite in terms of how the U.S. dealt with this at home? What were those?
Well, they were afraid. They were afraid, like if they took down the Twin Towers and almost the Pentagon, then which buildings will be next? Where are they gonna?
Yeah, or any public gatherings, whether they're sporting events,
Yeah.
or entertainment venues or other seats of government. So what are they going to have to do to combat that? How are you going to protect all these now all of a sudden vulnerable targets?
Like more security at airports.
Okay.
Like that.
So you're going to get this new thing called you're going to get a whole new Department of Homeland Security, where now you're going to have up the level of security around the nation, particularly, as Joe, you said, at airports. Airline travel is going to completely transform in order to address the new threat with the screening of baggage. They didn't use to screen baggage before it was put on the plane. People that you did not have to be searched and have all your carry-on searched or walk through metal detectors before getting on a plane. There were things you could take on the plane, whether they were hairsprays or pocket knives, or various things that you could get away with. But now that's going to have to completely change because we've seen this as a threat. And that's actually going to lead to, you're going to have the same thing beginning to emerge at sporting events or anywhere there's large gatherings, where now you're going to have a higher level of security, metal detectors, and awareness that, because this is not a soldier in a uniform that's now the enemy, this is what we call an insurgent, where they could look just like an average citizen, like these guys did, and end up being a threat. And so you're going to have to increase security, especially airports, but all other places as well. You used to be able to get a lot closer to government buildings in Washington, D.C., and now there's kind of little barricades there so that big vehicles can't drive up that could potentially contain explosives and yada, yada, yada.
It kind of when they were fighting the Viet Cong people,
say that again. There is a similarity, yeah.
They kind of because you couldn't tell who they were. But they were just
It's going to be the same frustration. And when we get to the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, that's exactly the same difficulty that was faced in Vietnam. Absolutely. Yep. The other big way to protect is surveillance. And so you have the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, and then you have this thing called the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is basically gives new surveillance measures powers to the government so that they can access private records, phone records, information, wiretaps, and things like that on American citizens, because they're realizing the other way we can stop these guys is if we can track them better. And when people who are questionable, coming from questionable countries or backgrounds, we want to be able to track them in the United States and listen in on their conversations and potentially prevent, plots before they happen. And so the Patriot Act allowed the government to have a whole nother invasion, access to people's privacy that they'd never had before. And to a large extent, that's been very successful. A lot of plots have been foiled because of their access to this, these extra surveillance techniques. We haven't had anything on the scale of 9/11 since. And so they did, that both of these measures have had an impact. And you can track the different types of terrorist attacks over the time and how they've evolved, but these have kept the damage and the threat down pretty well here in the United States. But of course, both of those things lead to, tensions, because what are you trading away in order to be safer?
Privacy.
Privacy.
Yep,
Yeah.
you're trading away privacy. Very good. What else?
The liberty to go anywhere with anything.
Yeah, liberty. You're trading away liberty or freedom. And so when we talk, saying here is tensions, this just is an important lesson from this period of time, in that when and we're facing it right now with the COVID-19, the same tension in a way, in that when there's a threat, you're going to have to maybe trade away some of your freedoms and some of your privacy for the larger good and the larger security. And in the years and months right after 9/11, people were pretty happy to do that. And they said, these Patriot Acts, these things are going to have to be renewed every couple of years or so. But the question is, at what point do we ever take that back? Do we ever cause the government to take away some of its power to keep spying and surveilling us? Or is that just going to become the new normal, and the government's going to know everything about us? And so that's just a tension. That's something as American citizens we have to be aware of. How much safety do I want versus how much freedom and privacy am I willing to take? There's people who made the argument, yes, the 3,000 people killed were horrible, but maybe even if that were to happen every 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or whatever, somehow maybe that sacrifice is even worth not losing too much of our freedom, or not losing too much of our liberty, or not having a government grow too powerful that it knows everything about us. I'm not saying that's the answer, but those are the questions being asked, because it's a trade-off: security versus freedom, security versus privacy. And people fall into, and same thing with the COVID-19, the same thing, we're dealing with that now. There's a risk as we reopen, and some people are like, you know what, the risk is worth it. I know there's going to be more sickness, there might be some more deaths, but there's going to be more damage if we don't, so we need to open it up. Other people are saying, no, we need to keep trading some of that freedom for better security. And so that very same tension, in a way, we're dealing with right now. Or even privacy, in terms of people, medical records, or requiring people to get vaccines, or requiring people to have their temperature taken before they can go do stuff. Your medical information is a form of privacy. And there's kind of a debate in our country right now. Well, how much should if you're going to get me sick, shouldn't I have access to your medical information? Other people saying, no, that's really fundamental right to not have the government know your medical history. And so it's the very same, a lot of the same decisions or debates going on right now. Questions on that paragraph? We're doing okay?
This is a quick question about the intro. What would be something basic to write for it?
Well, I think you that the attacks on 9/11 are a pivot point in American policy at home and abroad, because we always wanted to be as open of a society as possible. We wanted to keep a government as small as possible, and also that we had been focused on the threats of communism. We'd been focused on the threats of the Soviet Union. We had then won that battle. We had emerged as a world superpower. There was no nation at the time that was even close. major influencer, and then the attacks on 9/11 signaled, here's almost like, I mean, it's almost like a movie, like, okay, now here's the new bad guy. Okay, here's the new threat, and it's different than anything you've ever seen before. And you're going to have to change the way you live at home, and you're going to have to change your foreign policy, and you're going to have to restructure your military in order to face that threat. And in doing so, you're going to have to make sure you still remain that free, open society that you supposedly want to become. Because the easiest way to protect everybody is to just take total control of everything and have a big government that protects us and keeps us safe in a bubble. But that's not necessarily, that's not the American way. That's not how we want to live. And so how are we going to do that? And that's
now, what country does that?
That's what 9/11 forces us to do. What was your question?
I was just like, so what country does that sound like? Because we had been fighting.
Yeah.
Because we had been fighting oppressive governments and governments who were like spying on their citizens and who knew everything about that. And after these attacks, we started to adopt some of those policies into our own America.
Yeah, and I wouldn't overstate that. I wouldn't overstate that all of a sudden we became like the communists, or we became like this really, police state. A lot of those things they did were temporary, and it was nothing near. But you're right in that it is that is a good point. That is like the direction. Like, we don't want to head in that direction. We want to remember our first principle, freedom, and then so how are we safe along with, most of all, staying free. So don't overstate that all of a sudden we became like that. But that is the tension. That is the awareness of what we're gonna of what we want to do. If that makes sense. Let's see. Okay. So let's talk about then foreign policy. So domestically, we got the Department of Homeland Security. We've got the Patriot Act. We've got to deal with the threat of incursion of national threats into our population. So the other way to prevent that is what we call the Bush Doctrine. And actually, I'll put that here, the Bush Doctrine. And what that doctrine was basically, if you are a nation that harbors these terrorists, if you harbor organizations like Al Qaeda, even though they're not part of your government, they're not officially, you don't in a way officially condone them, but if you're allowing them to exist in your borders, if you won't surrender them to us, then we have the right to invade your country. And that's exactly what George W. Bush did. Is they said these are Al Qaeda bases are in Afghanistan, which is controlled by a group called the Taliban. And they went to the Taliban and said, you need to surrender and help us get these Al Qaeda guys. And when they refused, we said, well, then, our beef isn't really with you, but we're going to go into your country because we can't allow these guys to train and equip and then try to sneak into our country to harm us. So we're going to have to go to the source. And that's where the first invasion of Afghanistan, just a month or two after the attacks, takes place. And was it your guys' slides that you had the horse soldiers?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, I don't know how many of you knew that story, or if you've seen the movie 13 Strong or 12 Strong. But that was that very first Green Beret incursion team that went in to kind of create an alliance of Afghan leaders who weren't supportive of the Taliban and weren't supportive of Al Qaeda, to then try to topple the Taliban and capture and kill the Al Qaeda fighters. They're ultimately Osama bin Laden, but he's going to escape and be on the run for 10 years. So they actually go into Afghanistan in October of 2001. Again, you get 12 special forces, Green Beret soldiers. They help overthrow the Taliban in just 2 months. So they topple the Taliban government pretty quickly. However, it becomes an ongoing struggle, because then it kind of turns into an insurgency where the Taliban kind of sneak into the population. They disappear. They actually also hide across the border in Pakistan. And so we can't quite eliminate them. And then they sneak back across the border and carry out attacks. And so the longest running war in American history is actually our current war in Afghanistan. And President Trump is he's talked about trying to end that and remove the majority of the U.S. presence there. But it's been a really ongoing struggle against, trying to stamp. Al Qaeda is pretty decimated, but the Taliban continues to be a threat to that country.
Oh wait, it's still going on. Like they're still going back and forth with.
Yes, I'd say it's pretty low level. It's not like there's, and it's not like we don't have nearly as many troops as we did in the years following 9/11, and there aren't nearly the level of casualties that there were. But I forget. I mean, several. I mean, you could Google, and there's been quite a few American deaths even this year that as kind of still trying to keep the peace. That we have set up a democratic government in Afghanistan, but it's in a war against the Taliban for control of Afghanistan, and the country's kind of split between the two. And so we still have troops there trying to support the democratically elected Afghan government. But President Trump has said, he's actually in negotiations with the Taliban to see if we can come up with a power sharing scheme so that the U.S. can withdraw its troops. Other people don't like that idea. They say as soon as we leave, the Taliban is going to come back into control. But it's a persistent problem. So even though this is now 19 years ago, it's been a 19-year war. And so it's still kind of relevant to what the U.S. is dealing with abroad. What year is Osama bin Laden killed? Does anybody know?
I'm just gonna guess 2003.
Okay, yeah, no, we wish 2011.
Oh.
It takes 10 years if you've seen the Zero Dark 30. But 10 years. It takes 10 years to finally track him, and he's hiding where most of Al Qaeda and the Taliban are hiding in Pakistan. And then the special forces are finally able, SEAL Team 6 and all that are able to go in and kill him. And Al Qaeda is much weaker than it was, but we're still kind of engaged in this low level war on terror. And so the second big act of the war on terror is the war in Iraq. And this takes place in April of 2003. Does anybody know who the dictator of Iraq was? I'll write his name, Saddam Hussein. Okay, he was a dictator of Iraq, and he was no friend of the United States. In fact, we'd fought a war against him in the 1990s called the Gulf War. And the U.S. feared, they believed that he actually had what are called, does anybody know what WMDs are? They're weapons of mass destruction. Basically, they believed that he was trying to develop nuclear weapons, but that he also had poison gas weapons. We know he used poison gas against some of his own people. And so they feared that he had those and that he was going to be another base like Afghanistan for Al Qaeda fighters, and that he was even developing weapons because there was a big fear. The ultimate fear was if you have a rogue nation like Iran or Iraq or even North Korea making nuclear weapons or even chemical weapons, and then a terrorist group like Al Qaeda gets a hold of these, even a low level, made at home nuclear weapon or chlorine gas or whatever terrible chemical agent they have, if they were able to get that and sneak it into a place like London or Madrid or Washington, D.C., that would actually be devastating in the same way 9/11 was. So with the fear that Saddam Hussein was developing these extremely devastating weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, they said, we're going to have to go in and take out Saddam Hussein in order to make sure that place doesn't become a breeding ground or a provider of these weapons to groups like Al Qaeda. And so in April of 2003, the U.S. goes in and topples Saddam Hussein out of that fear.
Do they kill him?
They actually capture him. They find him hiding in a hole a few weeks after the invasion, and he's put on trial, and the Iraqi government executes him. He's hung. He's hung by the Iraqi people. He's put on trial for crimes against his own people.
In what year?
2003. 2003. The issue that the Iraq war, though, becomes very controversial, though, for two reasons. One, we never find WMDs. It appears he had them in the past, but that he scrapped them, and that we had bad intelligence that he was still having them. He was a pretty bad dude, but we never found any evidence he had the things that we feared he had that would be given to the terrorists. So people were like, wow, we just went in and created a whole war and toppled a government and over nothing. And so that was controversial. The other thing is that just the United States having another army in the Middle East was like a rallying cry to Islamic terrorists. and militant Islam, that they said, hey, you know what? You can go to Iraq and you can kill Americans. You can go to Iraq and you can fight jihad. And so while Iraq was not a hotbed of terrorism like Afghanistan was, once the Americans were there, it's like a magnet that drew in all these militant fighters from all over the Middle East. And so a huge kind of civil war and insurgency breaks out in Iraq. And so the US, again, just like Afghanistan, they topple Saddam Hussein very easily, but then they're stuck trying to keep a peace in a very Viet Cong like situation where you have Iraqis who are glad they're there, you have Iraqis who are not glad they're there, but they're peaceful, and then you have other Iraqis and non-Iraqis, just people from all over the Middle East, coming there with the sole purpose to just kill as many Americans as they can in the name of jihad.
Well, didn't we have a conflict with Iraq recently? It was like the end of 2019 and the start of 2020. We were kind of have like a back and forth with Iraq, not like fighting, but verbal.
Well, one of the arguments is we still have troops there, kind of as advisors, and we actually have a base there. And the Iraqi government they'll vote and they'll say, do we want these Americans here or not? Do we want Americans on our soil? Do we want them to have a base in our country? And they'll threaten that's controversial for them. And their elections, and depending on who gets elected over there, they argue over whether we want to kick the Americans out because they're more trouble than they're worth. And that's kind of the debate. They haven't yet, because again, the U.S. brings a certain stability there. But it was even like you guys, the more recent extension of this conflict is ISIS, Islamic State. And that was an outgrowth, not of Al-Qaeda, but it's just another terrorist group that was created through all these kind of Middle Eastern tensions with the goal of fighting the United States and other non-Muslim powers in the Middle East. So again, it's just very complicated. As I said, going back to the new type of threat, the U.S. has spent the last 20 years trying to figure out how do we successfully fight these threats before they get to our borders, before they get on our planes, before they get among us. A lot of people always took pride in the fact that the U.S. only ever fought a defensive war, and they thought, a lot of people, that Afghan war wasn't very controversial, but the fact that we went people saw it as aggressively into Iraq. People thought that wasn't too aggressive of a war. It was a preventative war, and people thought that's not okay. We need to wait until it's clear that there's a threat against us and we're clearly defending ourselves. So that was one of the debates that rages. The other debate was that the U.S. has tried to create democratic governments in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's very questionable whether that really works, because we don't know how much the majority of Afghan people or Iraqis actually want democracy, or if they know how to utilize it. So I'd say this is bringing us to the current day, because as you just said, that Iraq is still in the news, that we're still trying to figure out how to successfully do that. I think the current model has become, we don't want troops on the ground. Don't put troops on the ground. We can advise and support those who support us. We can use drones, we can use air power. But again, it sounds a lot like the beginnings of Vietnam. But do we really want to commit a lot of troops to a ground war in the Middle East when we don't know what the point is? What are they trying to, what's the objective? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, the thing about that is we did use drones, except they blocked stuff and shot them down, so that didn't really work either.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, actually, drone strikes have proven to be pretty successful at kind of more like a pinpointed attack. The two big changes, if you want to include this, is drones, because you can do these precision strikes against just the leaders. So rather than go in and try to wipe out a whole training camp or topple an entire government or this kind of large scale war, which again is what we were used to. Some people say the way we fight the current war, we're always fighting it the way the last war was fought, when we actually need to adapt our strategies. And that's what we've slowly been learning. But now we can kind of pinpoint, and you'll hear in the news, oh, this particular leader of this cell was killed in a drone strike, or this particular leader was taken out. So they've actually proven to be very successful, and mixed with special forces. The current U.S. military they've been re-engineering to have a lot more special forces groups, where again, we can send these strike teams in to either train supportive soldiers or to maybe go in and do like what they did with Osama bin Laden. Maybe not a drone strike, but you send them in to capture or kill one of these leaders who are helping to create the terrorist movement. And so rather than, big old armed divisions of soldiers and tanks and helicopters and all this stuff, now it's much more, okay, pinpoint drone strikes and pinpoint special force missions. And that's kind of why special forces, if you've noticed in terms of movies and kind of popular culture, have become much more kind of in the limelight, because that's kind of how we've chosen, that's how we've been fighting this war on terror. And that might even, I think that's what I think just emphasize that. New strategies, mention those two new strategies. And it continues to kind of be ongoing. Though now I get that, and as a history teacher, I'm always waiting to see what's my next topic would be. But now I think with this whole COVID-19 and the role that China's played, people kind of see a shift in, even away from the war on terror that we're now living in now, maybe a little bit more of a focus on how are we going to have another kind of Cold War with China, because of its principles and how they're so contradictory to American principles.
Wait,
But
so
go ahead.
we're fearing another like war, China using like MAD and the same principles we used the Soviet Union in the 1900s?
No, I don't think so. But there is, because it's becoming more and more clear that the Chinese government is basically fighting or strategizing a long-term conflict with the United States, and that they are slowly undermining American power. They're not just like, oh, another country that's different from us that we can coexist with, but that there actually is kind of a subtle conflict developing in terms of ideology and espionage and stealing of secrets and taking of territories and these different things, and that the U.S. is going to have to recognize they're now more of a national security threat than the terrorists have been the last 20 years. So I'm just saying, you don't have to put this in your paper. I'm just ruminating on that until just the last year or two. This was the national security focus was the war on terror. That could be changing as we speak. We'll see. I'm not saying outright war, no, and that's why I would use the word kind of a Cold War, or even a strategic opponent. Okay, so what? The tragedy reveals a new vulnerability to a new threat. Again, this was a new pivot from, hey, the communists are gone, the Soviets have collapsed, it's a safer world. Okay, here's the next episode. Okay, terrorism. How are we going to fight that? That's what 9/11 really signals, that new pivot to that, against that new threat, and that it is a domestic threat like no other. In other words, we hadn't had a conflict that was hitting us at home in the same way as 9/11 signaled. That what is also unique is that this is where you'll have Islamic jihadists shooting up San Bernardino, or you'll have a guy on a military base in Florida, or you'll have, it's much more, it's not large scale, but it is more intimate. And that's why the national security, the way we live here in the United States, had to change based on this conflict. And so I think that's significant. It's a war without borders. Okay. And then I think the other thing, as we've talked about it in the summary, is just it recognizes the struggle between security and principles. Principles like freedom, principles like privacy, principles like, the U.S. doesn't fight a war unless we're attacked. So is it against our principles to go after a country that we think is a threat, or do we have to wait and take the risk of waiting? It's a real struggle. When you're afraid or you feel threatened, it's a real challenge to what your principles actually are. I would never cheat. Well, wait till you're really afraid and think your whole life's going to fall apart. And all of a sudden you might be thinking, well, maybe now is the time I might need to, fudge this a little bit. America, we want to be free. Oh, wait, there's terrorism. Well, maybe freedom needs to change a little bit. And so it's really symbolic of that struggle, or it's a good example of that struggle between security and then our principles. Okay. Any preguntas or questions? I miss having you guys in class.
Yeah.
Appreciate you guys showing up.
The Final Four.
Yeah, the final four. That's it. We are done. So you guys write this summary, get your slide decks and your quiz done for this week. And then by Monday, there'll be a quizzes that'll just have a couple questions picked from each event this semester. And you can practice that all week. And then that exact same quiz, you will have to take it at the specific time on Friday morning. And that'll be your fourth quarter test. And then of course, and then get your website finished up.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you know like about how many questions are gonna be?
I
on
would
it?
say, I think we've done about around 14 events. So there's going to be around, I would say about 30 questions.
Okay.
Like I said, two from each event. I'm going to be writing it today. So
No.
we'll see. I don't want to make it crazy long. That's not the point, but just to kind of hit upon what kind of a key thing from each event.
All right.
30?
What was it? Sound too long?
Well, I mean, no, it's decent actually, but wait, so we've had 14. Is that like since the railroad? Is that what we're starting from?
I'm throwing that completely off the top of my head. Yes, it
Don't
is
we have, like, 8?
It'll be Transcontinental Railroad to 9/11. Yep.
Is it? Oh, it's like
I
did we
died. I'm
lose, like,
I'm no
halfway
longer.
through something, or
Sorry,
did you
Emma,
just
what?
did you just have more events this time around, or because usually we have about like 7 to 8.
Well, what that is that's the whole semester.
Oh.
You know, and so usually even when we take, if you remember, and this is what you're not going to have to do, is usually that fourth quarter test. And this is why originally, if nothing had changed, that website would have gotten you out of it, because I can see that it's a lot of work, but you actually would normally have on the fourth quarter test the entire year. You'd have Columbus all the way up to 9/11.
Yeah.
This is just going to be some review questions from the third and fourth quarter.
Okay.
And there's not going to be a timeline. You know, there might be some date questions, but there's not going to be a timeline that you fill in. You're not going to write a paragraph and do all the stuff you'd normally have to do on the fourth quarter test.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
All righty, I'll let you guys go. I'm going to stop this here. But yeah, thank you, Final Four, and I'll be there next Friday, so I'll be excited to see you.
Oh yeah.
Well,
You won't be able to hide behind your name screens. Your crazy hair and your unbrushed teeth and all the new pimples that have broken out.
Yeah, definitely.
Just kidding. All right. Well, happy Friday, guys. Appreciate it.
Yay.
Thank you, Joey.
Have
Thank you,
a good
Kenzie.
weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
Kenzie, did you
you.
finish Dune yet?
No, I'm like a fourth of the way through.
Are you enjoying it? Or is
Yeah,
it
it's
kind of
really
weird?
cool.
Oh, you do like it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, guys. Have a good day.
you too.
Yeah. Uh-huh.